Chapter 1, The Betrayal. The moment I opened my bank app, my world cracked. All my life savings, every penny I had painstakingly set aside, every sacrifice I had made for a future I thought we were building together, was gone. And in its place, a single transaction, transferred to Damele for wedding expenses. My stomach dropped. My hands trembled. Not with fear, but with a burning, unrelenting rage. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had used it to marry her. His ex. The woman he swore he'd never see again. I could hear the echo of our laughter in the apartment, the whispers of promises that now rang hollow. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of my mind, a voice, soft, ancestral, warning me, told me, this is not the end, child. This is the beginning. Damele thought he had won. That he could erase me from his life and rewrite history with her. He didn't know that I had been patient, that I had been planning. He didn't know that when the time came, I would leave him with nothing. And tonight, on the night he thought he would celebrate love and triumph, I would make him feel the weight of every betrayal he had ever committed. Because some debts cannot be ignored. They must be collected. Chapter 2, The Silence Before the Storm. The apartment felt suffocating, though I hadn't moved from the couch for hours. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, streetlights flickered, and neighbors' laughter drifted through the thin walls, but inside, my world had imploded. I stared at the empty spot where my savings had once been. All those years of waking before dawn, working extra shifts, skipping weekends, refusing luxuries, all of it stolen, siphoned into the gilded dreams of a man who never deserved my trust. My first instinct had been to scream, to confront him, to throw the weight of my fury directly into Damele's smug face. But that was what he wanted. His arrogance thrived on reactions, on the rawness of emotion. No. I would not give him the satisfaction. I took a deep breath, pressing my fingers against the ancient amulet that hung around my neck, a delicate gold pendant shaped like a crescent moon, passed down from my grandmother. She had always said it held wisdom, that it could steady the heart when chaos threatened to overwhelm the mind. I whispered into it, a silent promise, I will make him pay. But he would never see it coming. The first step was observation. I watched him for days, from the periphery of my life, careful not to be seen. He walked with his usual cocky swagger, laughing with Tola as though the universe had conspired in their favor. They posted pictures online, shared every detail of the lavish preparations, flaunted their happiness like a knife twisting in my chest. But I saw cracks where they did not. I saw arrogance masquerading as confidence. I saw entitlement that blinded him to consequences. I began gathering evidence. I printed statements, screenshots, bank confirmations, and contracts. Every fraudulent transfer, every misused penny of my savings, it all became part of a growing dossier. Each night, I meticulously organized the document on the dining table, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. I traced every step Damele had taken, every lie he had whispered in my ear, every betrayal he had buried beneath charm and empty apologies. It was exhausting, yes, but there was a grim satisfaction in it. I was building not just a case, but a fortress. A cage he would find himself trapped in, when the time came. The city slept around me, oblivious to the storm brewing in the little apartment. Only I knew how close it was, how inevitable. Every time I glanced at the amulet, I imagined my grandmother's eyes, sharp and wise. Revenge is sweetest when it is silent, child. Strike only when all pieces are in place. And so I waited. For Damele, the universe had set a date, a day of celebration, a day he thought would solidify his triumph. But I had other plans. The silence before the storm was my ally. The calm, the patience, the cold planning, these were the tools of my power. And with each passing hour, my resolve hardened, until it felt unbreakable. By the time the wedding invitations hit the mailboxes, I had already begun planting the seed of ruin. The venue, the financial arrangements, the legal papers, they were all being quietly, invisibly transferred to my control. Every step of their ostentatious plan was now tethered to me, unknowingly to them. And on that quiet, ordinary night, as Damele bragged to friends about how he had won, I smiled to myself. Not a joyous smile, not a triumphant one, but a calm, chilling acknowledgement, he has no idea what's coming. Tonight, I would sleep knowing that the storm was coming. And when it broke, it would leave them with nothing. Nothing but the echo of their own arrogance. Chapter 3, The Plan Unfolds. The morning I decided to strike, the sky was an unsettling shade of grey, thick clouds gathering low, heavy like the weight on my chest. It felt symbolic, as if the ancestors themselves had lowered the heavens to witness what I was about to do. I sat at my dining table, the work table now, lit only by a single candle. The flame flickered unevenly, throwing shifting shadows across the piles of documents I had arranged like an army waiting for command. Bank statements, transaction logs, photocopies, receipts I had scanned and highlighted until the ink bled. Each one was a confession he didn't know he had written. But the most important paper was the one lying at the center, power of attorney, revocable, effective immediately. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Alaka, had drawn it up with a precision that mirrored her personality. She had glanced over the bank fraud evidence with a slow, controlled shock. "You're not just dealing with a thief," she had said. "You're dealing with someone who thinks you won't fight back." She didn't know how right she was. I spent hours on the phone, setting silent traps, redirecting funds, freezing accounts. Each call was a needle threaded quietly into the seams of Damele's grand wedding. He thought he was assembling a kingdom. I was loosening the foundations brick by brick. By noon, I had executed the first phase. The wedding venue, an extravagant hall with golden chandeliers and marble floors, had been struggling financially for months. A few well-placed payments, made with my own reclaimed funds, and a discreet conversation with the desperate owner changed everything. The contract for the venue was now mine, signed, sealed, paid in full. In my name only. The wedding planner didn't even suspect. She simply updated the record, assuming the bride and groom had authorized it. Everyone saw the illusion I wanted them to see. That's the beauty of betrayal, I thought, as I flipped through the newly signed papers. People who betray rarely expect to be betrayed back. As evening approached, I drove to the outskirts of the city, where my grandmother was buried. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustling of leaves, the whisper of wind weaving through tall grasses. Her grave had always been a refuge during the storms of my life. I knelt beside the headstone, tracing the name, Ifeoma Chukwuemeka, etched in soft stone. "I remember your words, Mama Ifeoma," I whispered. "You said patience is sharper than any blade. And now I understand." A subtle chill ran across my skin. Not cold, but like a hand brushing my shoulder, gentle, encouraging. I lit a stick of incense, placing it gently at the base of the stone. "Give me strength," I murmured. "Give me clarity. And watch over me as I reclaim what is mine." The incense smoke curled upward, swirling in tight spirals like a message rising into the unseen. I stayed there until the light dimmed and shadows stretched long across the ground. When I returned home, the city lights blinked like watchful eyes. I felt the shift inside me, the transformation from the woman who loved him to the woman who would dismantle his entire existence. I spread the papers across the bed this time, needing to see the full scope of my power. Damele's accounts were frozen. The florist had quietly cancelled after discovering the groom's payment was suspicious. The catering company now required a fresh deposit, one I knew he didn't have. But the final move, the masterpiece, came just after midnight. I sent an anonymous tip to Tola's boutique manager about an unpaid fabric supplier bill, one Damele had promised to cover. By morning, Tola would be drowning in calls demanding money she could no longer access. Their perfect wedding was cracking. Their perfect union splintering, piece by piece. And they didn't even know the storm had begun. I stood at my window, watching lightning flash in the distance. The rumble of thunder followed seconds later, deep, resonant, like the growl of something ancient waking from slumber. It felt right. It felt aligned. By the time the rain began to fall, steady and cleansing, everything was set in motion. All that remained was the day itself, the day they thought would crown them king and queen. The day I would take everything back and leave them with absolutely nothing. Chapter 4, The Wedding Day. The morning of the wedding broke with a cruel kind of brightness, a sky washed clean after a storm, sunlight sharp enough to cut. It felt mocking, almost. A day too beautiful for what was about to happen. But beauty has always been the perfect disguise for ruin. I woke early, long before the city stirred. For the first time in weeks, my mind was clear. No tremor of doubt. No shadow of guilt. Only the steady pulse of purpose. My amulet rested cold against my chest, but the cold felt reassuring. Grounded. Like the ancestors themselves were placing a hand over my heart. I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple black dress that fell over my body like calm water, no glitter, no makeup tricks, nothing that drew attention. I wanted to enter the battlefield not as a spectacle, but as a shadow. A shadow that carried truth sharp enough to wound. By the time I reached the venue, the entire hall was a hive of celebration. Guests in shimmering fabrics flooded the entrance. Photographers flashed cameras. A string quartet played something soft and romantic near the garden walkway. The air smelled of flowers, roses, lilies, gardenias, arranged in towering bouquets that cost more than some people's monthly rent. The facade was perfect, but I knew the truth beneath it. Inside the hall, everything glittered. Gold-trimmed chairs, crystal goblets, satin ribbons tied to pillars. Damele had spared no expense, because he hadn't spent his own money. As I walked through the entrance, a few guests glanced at me with curiosity, but no one stopped me. I didn't belong here, yet I fit effortlessly. Calm. Composed, invisible in plain sight. Then I saw him. Damele stood near the altar, adjusting his cufflinks, laughing with a friend. He looked proud, arrogantly so. His suit was white, tailored perfectly, the same shade he once said he wanted for our wedding someday. My stomach tightened, not with pain, but with the sharp edge of memory cracking apart and falling away. Tola arrived moments later, sweeping into the hall like a princess who believed the world owed her devotion. Her gown was extravagant, lace pearls, long sleeves, a train so long it practically dragged half the hall behind it. Her smile was radiant. Her confidence blinding, and her ignorance almost poetic. She walked past me without noticing, her perfume trailing behind her like a floral thread. Damele's eyes lit up when he saw her, admiration swelling in him like pride he hadn't earned. I watched from the shadows as the officiant prepared. Guests settled. The air thickened with anticipation. Then, at the exact moment the ceremony was supposed to begin, I stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough to be seen by the people who mattered, the hall manager, the security team, the financial officer from the venue whose signature rested beside mine in the new ownership contract. I handed him the folder. He opened it. Read the page. His eyes widened. Then he whispered into his walkie-talkie. 3 things happened almost simultaneously. 1. The lights over the altar flickered once, twice, then dimmed. 2. The entrance doors locked with a hard mechanical click. 3. And the venue audio system, instead of playing the soft violin piece the couple had chosen, emitted a crackling silence. A silence so deep it pressed against the skin. The guests shifted uneasily. Tola blinked in confusion. Damele frowned, annoyed but not yet afraid. That came next. The hall manager stepped onto the stage, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd with a controlled, icy professionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we must pause the ceremony. There appears to be a legal ownership conflict regarding the venue. As of this morning, This property belongs to Miss Amara Chokomika. Gasps erupted across the hall. Dozens of heads turned toward me. I stepped forward, calm as water. Damale's face drained of color, the arrogance melting off him like wax in fire. Amara. He choked. What are you doing here? His voice echoed across the marble floor, small and trembling in a hall he no longer controlled. Tola grabbed his arm. What is this? What's he talking about, Dami? I could have explained everything. Exposed every lie. Laid out every crumb of betrayal. But I refused to let them pull emotion from me. Not today. I simply lifted the folder in my hand, a thick, damning collection of signed transfers, fraud evidence, banking statements, contract agreements. Everything you used to build this wedding, I said softly, belongs to me. Every naira. Every booking. Every chair. Every rose petal on this floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then. You. Tola pointed at me with shaking fingers. You're lying. You're trying to ruin our wedding. It was already built on theft, I cut in. I'm simply taking back what's mine. Before she could speak again, uniformed security stepped forward, my security, not theirs. Hide by the venue the moment ownership changed hands. One guard leaned toward the couple. I'm sorry, but you're required to vacate the property. Immediately. The hall erupted into chaos. Guests whispered. Some stood. A few took out their phones. Tola began to scream, high, shrill, disbelieving. Damale sputtered, trying to argue, waving his hands like a man drowning. But security didn't budge. They ushered the couple toward the doors, which remained locked until I nodded. Only then did the hall manager signal for them to be opened. Damale turned back to me as he was pushed out, his voice cracking. Amara, please, let's talk. But I had nothing left to say. Nothing for a man who gambled with my future. Nothing for a woman who helped him spend my savings. Nothing for two people who built a palace from my sacrifice. Outside, the sun still shone too brightly, almost cruel in its beauty. Inside, the guests remained speechless. And I stood in the center of the hall, my hall now, breathing in the cold, righteous air of justice fulfilled. Tonight, they would have nowhere to sleep. No money in their accounts. No venue. No wedding. No victory to celebrate. I walked out of the hall slowly, steady, like a queen leaving a battlefield she had already claimed. Because today was not their beginning. It was their undoing. Chapter 5, the night they lost everything. Rain began to fall as the newly dethroned couple stumbled into the empty streets, Tola's heels slipping on the wet pavement, Damale's expensive shoes squelching in puddles. The guests had mostly scattered, some whispering behind their umbrellas, some secretly impressed, some horrified at the unfolding chaos. But Damale and Tola were trapped in their own unraveling world, completely unprepared for the consequences of their greed. I watched from the car parked a block away, the rain slicking my hair to my face, clinging to my black dress. I could see every detail, the manic panic in Damale's eyes, the self-righteous anger in Tola's, the realization dawning that everything they had relied on was gone. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. The first call came moments later. Tola's boutique manager had called incessantly, demanding payment for fabric shipments that had never been settled. Damale's phone rang off the hook, bank notifications, overdraft alerts, automatic bill warnings. Every account that had once seemed untouchable was now frozen or reversed. The evidence I had collected had done its work quietly, legally, perfectly. And as the night deepened, the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside their lives. Lightning lit up the streets in sudden, jagged flashes. Thunder rolled across the sky, loud enough to drown out the sound of their frantic voices. They had no home to retreat to, no room to hide. Every hotel within their means had already been contacted by me through careful, anonymous warnings, rooms held for, unpaid accounts, that did not exist. Every path they attempted to take, every door they knocked on, was met with rejection. Damalea, once cocky and smug, now shouted like a man unraveling, "Amara, you can't do this. We'll sue you." Will. But there was no one to hear him, no system to protect him. And I wasn't there to argue. Justice had no need for words. It had results. Tola sank to her knees in the mud, the train of her gown torn and soaking. The vanity she had clung to, the beauty, the social recognition, the illusion of control, had dissolved in an instant. She screamed, a piercing, raw sound that carried across the empty streets, but there was no audience left to respond. Damalea grabbed her arm roughly, his anger rising, and for a brief moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity died in the same instant his betrayal had been revealed. He had gambled with my life, my future, my dignity. And I had won. I did not approach. I did not gloat. That was the quiet, unshakable power of true victory. It required no theatrics. Instead, I returned to my apartment, walking through the rain as if it were a baptism. Every droplet that struck my skin washed away the remnants of grief, leaving clarity and freedom in its place. My amulet pulsed warmly against my chest, and I knew, without doubt, that the ancestors were pleased. By the time I reached my door, I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had reclaimed everything. Every naira, every ounce of effort, every shred of self-respect they had attempted to steal was back in my hands. I entered my apartment and closed the door behind me. The storm outside softened to a gentle patter, almost like applause. I sat in silence for a long while, letting the weight of the night settle. Damalea and Tola were left in the cold, literally and metaphorically. Homeless, humiliated, stripped bare of their illusions. And I was home. I poured a glass of water and held it in my hands, looking at the small flicker of candlelight. The warmth of the flame reminded me of something my grandmother once said: "Some fires are not for burning others, they are for lighting your own path." Tonight, my path was illuminated. And the darkness of betrayal no longer haunted me. I smiled, a quiet, serene smile that carried every ounce of triumph, every whisper of ancestral pride. The rain outside tapped against the windows like a soft, congratulatory rhythm. And I knew, without doubt, that this chapter was over. But my life was finally mine again. Chapter 6, Aftermath of the Storm. The morning after the storm, the city seemed different. Not brighter, not calmer, just quieter, as if it had been holding its breath through the night, waiting to see the consequences of what had happened. And what had happened was nothing short of chaos. I opened my front door to find newspapers scattered across the sidewalk, headlines screaming. Lavish wedding crumbles, groom and bride left homeless on their big day, wealth, betrayal, and the woman who took it all. I picked one up, flipping through the article. They painted me as some kind of mythic avenger, a dark heroine of modern scandal. I smiled faintly. Truth had a strange way of being stranger than fiction. Even the social media feeds were alive with whispers, screenshots, and commentary. Friends, acquaintances, and strangers alike debated the audacity of the act. Some cheered me silently, others condemned me, but all were talking. All were aware that Amara Chukwuemeka had struck, and struck hard. I poured a cup of coffee, its bitter warmth grounding me, and walked to the balcony. Below, the streets were sleek and reflective, mirroring neon lights and puddles of rainwater. I imagined Damalea and Tola wandering somewhere out there, shivering, humiliated, grasping at a world that no longer belonged to them. But my mind did not linger on their suffering. It lingered on the clarity I had gained. The echo of silence. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car. Silence had never felt so restorative. For weeks, I had been plotting, calculating, planning revenge. Now that it had been executed, there was a strange emptiness, a stillness after the storm. I moved to the living room and picked up the folder I had carried to the wedding. The papers felt heavier than they had in the hall, but this weight was different. It was the weight of justice completed. I thought about the nights I had spent awake, pacing, imagining their smug faces, imagining the moment when they would finally realize their kingdom was gone. It had arrived. And yet, the greatest satisfaction wasn't in watching them fall. It was in knowing that I had rebuilt myself in the process. Whispers of consequence. No storm passes without leaving a mark, though. Within hours, subtle tremors began. Calls from old colleagues, unsure if they should congratulate or warn me. Messages from distant family, cautious but curious, sensing the ripple of scandal. Even my lawyer, Mrs. Aleka, asked carefully, "Amara, are you certain they won't retaliate?" I smiled, tracing the curve of my amulet with one finger. "They can try," I whispered aloud. "But the ancestors have already set the rules. This is not a game they can win." And in truth, they were powerless. Everything Damalea and Tola could touch legally, financially, or socially had been stripped. Every ally they had believed they could manipulate was either neutralized or aware of the truth, rebuilding the pieces. I spent the day not celebrating, but reconstructing. Bank accounts were stabilized under my name. Investments were checked, verified, and secured. Contracts for future projects, previously under my control but frozen, were reactivated. Every step reminded me that this story wasn't about revenge alone, it was about reclamation. My life, my savings, my dignity, all restored, stronger than before. Even in the quietest moments, the ancestral whisper lingered. The storm reveals the weak and strengthens the wise. Remember, child, nothing is permanent except truth. I closed my eyes, letting the words seep into my bones. For the first time in months, I felt untouchable, not in arrogance, but in absolute clarity. Outside, the city began to stir. Rain-soaked streets glimmered, reflecting the early sunlight like shards of broken glass. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined Damalea and Tola wandering aimlessly, finally understanding that their choices had consequences far beyond their comprehension. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and smiled faintly. Not in triumph over them, but in triumph over myself. The storm had passed. And in its wake, a new chapter of life awaited. Chapter 7, Rising Shadows. The days after the wedding disaster passed with a deceptive calm. The city had resumed its normal rhythm, yet a shadow lingered over me, a subtle awareness that Damalea would not simply disappear into the night and accept his defeat. I was right. It started with whispers, phone calls from unknown numbers, vague threats masked as casual inquiries. Friends contacted me with curious questions. Did you hear about Damalea? Are you safe? Emails arrived, careful and coded, hinting that he was attempting to rebuild his influence through mutual acquaintances. But I was no longer the woman who slept beside him trusting his promises. I was vigilant. Every message was intercepted, every approach carefully traced. The first move. It was a Thursday afternoon when I noticed the first coordinated attempt. A former client of mine, someone Damalea had thought he could bribe, contacted me, visibly nervous. He explained that Damalea had offered large sums to gain insider information about my finances, my projects, even my personal life. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warmth of the sun through my window. Calm. Controlled. This was expected. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I set a quiet counter-trap, subtly feeding misinformation, setting fake leads, and ensuring that every contact Damalea used to gain leverage only strengthened my position. By the time he realized, it was too late. Every thread he attempted to pull tangled him further into his own mistakes. Allies in the shadows. The second layer of defense was more proactive. I began reaching out to allies I had ignored before, mentors, colleagues, and old friends, people who had always respected me but had hesitated to intervene in personal matters. They became my eyes and ears. Not spies, but loyal allies who understood the truth. Damale was dangerous, manipulative, and desperate. Through their efforts, I gathered intel, small schemes, financial manipulations, and desperate attempts to regain his lost status. It was almost poetic. He had underestimated me for so long, and now every desperate move he made was feeding the web I had quietly spun. Internal reflection. Even as the external game played out, I spent time reflecting on myself. The rage that had driven my initial revenge had cooled into something far more potent: clarity. I remembered the nights I had cried over betrayal, the mornings I had woken trembling from nightmares, the silent prayers to my grandmother's spirit for guidance. All of that pain had forged me into a woman who was no longer reactive. I was strategic, measured, untouchable. I walked through my apartment, fingers brushing over the amulet around my neck, feeling the ancestral warmth pulse faintly. The wise do not fight blindly. They prepare. They wait. They strike only when victory is absolute. Signs of desperation. By the end of the week, Damale's attempts had escalated. Rumors circulated that he was trying to sue, to reclaim assets, to damage my reputation. Tola, once self-assured and cruel, had become withdrawn, fearful of exposure, dependent entirely on the man she had once manipulated. And I watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction. Every move they made was predictable because they were driven by arrogance, by desperation, by short-term thinking. I, on the other hand, had patience, planning, and vision on my side. I allowed a small, private smile to curve my lips as I thought, they believe they can challenge me. They are blind to the storm that waits for them. The foreshadowing. That night, I lit incense at my grandmother's grave once more. The wind whispered through the trees as if echoing my resolve. This is only the beginning, I murmured. Their shadows rise, but mine are eternal. And with that, I turned away, feeling the weight of destiny settle around me like armor. The rising shadows of Damale and Tola were inevitable, but they were nothing compared to the storm I had already mastered, and would unleash when the time was perfect. Chapter 8: The Final Reckoning. It was a week after the wedding disaster. The city hummed around me, oblivious to the storm about to break one last time. I had been tracking every desperate move Damale made. Every attempt to regain control, every legal threat, every whisper through mutual contacts. And now, he had come to me directly, thinking he could intimidate, thinking he could reclaim what he believed was his. He arrived at my office in the late afternoon, drenched from a sudden rainstorm, his face pale and taut, the arrogance completely stripped away. Behind him, Tola trailed, her expensive dress ruined, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Damale's voice shook as he spoke. Amara, this has gone too far. We can fix this. We can. I didn't interrupt. I let him flail, let him expose the desperation that had consumed him. You can't fix this, I said finally, calm and steady, my voice cutting through the tension like steel. Every step you've taken to betray me has been documented, every attempt to manipulate me recorded. Legally, financially, socially, you have nowhere to turn. Damale's shoulders sagged. Tola gasped, realizing the totality of their loss. I walked slowly around my desk, giving weight to every step. You thought arrogance could shield you. You thought charm could erase the consequences of your actions. You were wrong. Completely wrong. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. This is not about revenge anymore. It is about justice. And justice, in this case, is final. The papers I had prepared, contracts, statements, evidence, were on the desk. Every single one spelled doom for them. Legal claims against me. Blocked. Assets frozen. Reversed. Their power stripped entirely. You wanted a kingdom, I said, voice low, deliberate. But a kingdom built on theft was never yours. It never belonged to you. And now, it's gone. Tola collapsed into a chair, trembling, while Damalea's face contorted with rage, humiliation, and disbelief. They had misjudged me at every turn, and now there was no redemption. I straightened, turning toward the door. Leave. And do not come back. This chapter is closed. They left wordlessly, their world in shambles, fully aware that the consequences of their choices were permanent. Epilogue, Rebirth. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. The storm had come and gone, leaving destruction in its wake, but also clarity and freedom. I walked through my apartment one morning, sunlight streaming through wide windows, reflecting on the months of planning, betrayal, and triumph. The amulet around my neck glimmered faintly, a reminder of guidance, wisdom, and ancestral protection. The city outside hummed with life, but I moved through it with purpose. My finances were secure, my projects advancing, and my reputation, once at risk, was now stronger than ever. People admired me, not out of fear, but because they understood strength when they saw it. For the first time, I considered the future. I could pursue my dreams without compromise, build wealth on my terms, even explore love, healthy, mutual, respectful, without fear of betrayal. And somewhere deep inside, I smiled. Not because Damalea and Tola had suffered, they had earned it, but because I had reclaimed my life fully. The storm had passed. The shadows had risen and fallen. And I had risen above them all. The city, my life, my future, they were mine again. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing, and no one, could ever take that from me.